This lecture was originally recorded during Reasons to Believe's 2015 Bermuda Cruise Conference. If you're benefiting from these talks, we hope you'll consider supporting RTB's ministry. To make a contribution, visit reasons.org and click on the Donate button.
And we're going to talk about specifically the Ice Age cycle and God's redemptive plan. Why we need an Ice Age cycle in order for God's redemptive plan to work out the way that He plans. Now, let me take you back about 20,000 years. 20,000 years ago, during the winter, this would be the view that you would see as you look out the window of this cruise ship. The Ice Age literally came all the way down to Bermuda. Here's a map of what it was like during the last Ice Age. As you heard yesterday, New York was under over 1,000 feet of ice, and Bermuda was just a little bit below the southernmost exposure of the winter ice pack that came down. And what we see here is the Ice Age cycle at its maximum, 23% ice coverage of the Earth. This is what it looks like right now, just 10% ice coverage of the Earth. But because we have 10%, technically, we're in an ice age. Anytime the planet has a significant amount of ice, we're in an ice age. And what we see in the Ice Age cycle is an oscillation between 10% ice coverage and 20 to 23% ice coverage. But for the vast majority of Earth's history, there was no ice at all. So this was typical of planet Earth. No ice, no polar ice caps. In fact, if you look at the ice history of the Earth, this is what it looks like. And these arrows here represent the length of time in which ice covered a significant fraction of the Earth. The first ice age showed up here, and then we have several here. And by the way, this is correlated when oxygen begins to build up in the atmosphere. You get a long period of ice. And this is the ice age we're in right now. We call it the Ice Age cycle. And what I want you to notice, of all the ice ages we have had, this one is the briefest. Typically, ice ages last millions of years, and this is the only one that is cyclical. What we have back here is ice that remains covering a large fraction of the Earth for millions or tens of millions of years. What's unique about the ice age we're in right now is that it's cyclical, going from, say, 10 to 20% ice. And this got launched 2.5 million years ago. And this is what it looked like 2.5 million years ago, where you would go from maximum ice to minimum ice with a period of about 40,000 years. And so you get these brief periods of minimum ice and then long periods of maximum ice. So it's maximum ice, minimum ice, and about every 40,000 years it goes through this cycle until 800,000 years ago. 800,000 years ago, the Ice Age cycle gets more dramatic. Instead of, say, 10 to 15 or 18%, it goes from 10 to 20 to 23%, and the period changes. Now we're looking at 100,000 years in the Ice Age, the periodicity of the Ice Age cycle, and what we call the interglacial, where it gets a little bit less ice coverage. This now lasts about 10,000 years instead of just 1,000 or 2,000 years. I think you can already see why it's important that we have an interglacial that's longer than 1,000 or 2,000 years in terms of a human civilization. And so this is where we are right now. And in this talk this morning, we're going to address two creation mysteries. One is, why an Ice Age cycle now and never before in Earth's history? You know, the Earth is 4.5 billion years old, and only in the last 2.5 million years have we had an Ice Age cycle. We're going to answer the question why. But I think more significantly, why is an Ice Age cycle crucial for fulfilling God's redemptive plan? Now, what is God's redemptive plan? A one-verse summary we find in Revelation. Before me was a great multitude that no one could count, from every tribe, nation, people, and language. And the point that was being made here in the book of Revelation, God's redemptive plan is not for a small number of people to come into a salvation relationship with Him, but a very large number of people. It says uncountable. Now, you can interpret that figuratively, that it's just going to be a very large number. Or what I notice is if you put it in the context of first century Greek culture, they had a numbering system that topped out at 1 billion. So they counted up to 1 billion, and then beyond that was uncountable. So that would imply that billions of people, according to God's plan, will come into relationship with Jesus Christ as Creator, Lord, and Savior. Now that would mean that planet Earth would have to have the conditions necessary so that billions of people could actually live on the planet. Today there's 7 billion people living on our planet at one time, and this is a big factor and why so many people. Because God's plan is that there be a large number of redeemed human beings in the new creation, and that requires Earth to be in a particular set of conditions to make it possible that even that many people could live together. Now, you've heard me say this before. You'll see this in all of our books. When you read the creation texts in the Bible, every one of the more lengthy creation texts always links God's doctrine of creation with his doctrine of redemption. Or to put it another way, God's works of creation are always for the purpose of his works of redemption. And actually what you see in Scripture is that God's works of redemption begin before his works of creation. So a little tip on how to interpret the creation text in the Bible. We're always to interpret them in the context of God's plan of redemption. Now, the first question I want to address is, why does Earth need an ice age cycle in order for the Earth to support billions of people at any particular time? Okay, I'm going to go through a list of 9 things. In the book that's coming out next year, we list many more than just 9, but these are 9 that I can get through fairly quickly. Number 1, we need melting glaciers to water the plains adequately enough that those plains can produce the food to sustain billions of people. And so the agriculture that we see on planet Earth today is basically benefiting from the melting of glaciers left over from the last ice age. And so this is what the ice age looked at maximum. By the way, here we're looking down on the Earth, looking down on the North Pole. This shows a 23% coverage. And by the way, what you see here in this blue color is the regions of the Earth where a minimum of 1,000 feet of ice, a kilometer of ice, was covering the land masses. So there's more ice than this, what you see here, but this is that part of the world where at least a kilometer thickness of ice was covering that region. And then this ice began to melt rather aggressively, starting about 20,000 years ago, and the melting of that basically feeds the great rivers that water the great agricultural plains. For example, we have this large polar cap over the Himalayan plateau, and the melting of that ice to this day is watering the great plains of India and China that sustain 3 billion people. Likewise, North America. There's melting of glaciers from the Cordilleran Range that feed the great prairies, and this takes place all over the world. Second factor, you get wind-blown dust. As the ice from the last ice age begins to recede, it exposes dirt on the high plateaus, and the relief caused by the glacial melt actually causes a strong wind to blow off the high plateaus and take that nutrient-rich dust and deposit it on the great agricultural plains. So thanks to the fact that we're in an ice age cycle, we're able to nutrient and enrich the great agricultural plains and then provide them with the water that they need in order for us to grow all the food to sustain billions of people. Okay, a third factor. Glacier retreat carves out lakes. So wherever you got these big sheets of ice, when they recede, it kind of carves out these concave bowls that make lakes. And what these lakes do is transform regions of the world that would otherwise be barren deserts into productive land. And then also the retreat of the glaciers carves out this relief that makes possible, all over the earth we got waterfalls. We're able to take advantage of those waterfalls and turn it into hydropower sources. So there's nations of the world, for example, where they get virtually all their electricity from hydropower. A good example of that would be Canada. Canada was totally covered with kilometers thick of ice. As that ice receded, it literally created millions of lakes. This shows you a view here, but what I'm going to do is show you a blow-up of just the province of Quebec. And what you see here is that literally a good chunk of Quebec is lakes and rivers. In fact, 10% of Canada is connecting rivers and lakes. And because of that, even though most of Canada gets 10 inches or less precipitation a year, instead of being a barren desert, it becomes a lush forest that we're able to use. And then we have all these rivers that make it possible for transportation, but they also deliver hydropower. For example, New York City gets almost all of its electricity from power generated in Labrador and Quebec. And in Canada, virtually all their hydroelectric power or electricity comes from that source. Siberia is another example of that. Europe, with the Alps that was covered with ice, likewise another example of that. And then as the glaciers retreat, they make many large, safe harbors. You've probably heard of fjords. Fjords are created by retreating glaciers. But what those glaciers do is they carve out these fjords and make these really large, safe harbors and make it possible for us human beings to transport products all over the world. And as the glaciers retreat, they expose rich ore deposits. I mean, where do we have some of the richest metal mines in the world? We have them in those regions where glaciers from the last maximal ice did retreat. And then as the ice retreats, it also creates these large alluvial plains. And last but not least, it creates spectacular scenery. So, for example, we have this in Southern California. Yosemite, Half Dome was carved by retreating glaciers. This whole valley and all the waterfalls was carved by retreating glaciers. Here we have Yosemite Falls. Again, a glacier carved out these thousands of feet of granitic relief. This is one that's still forming in Canada. These are glaciers left over from the last ice age, and as they retreat, they're going to be creating another equivalent of Yosemite Park. And if you were on our Alaska cruise, this is the example of a fjord, a beautiful fjord that was cut out thanks to the glacial retreat from the last ice age. I think God knew that with billions of people on the face of the earth, all with high technology jobs, that we'd be stressed to the max, and we needed beautiful scenery to be able to recover from the stress of our busy lives. Now, we laugh, but the whole point is God knew that we weren't just physical beings, we were soulish beings and spiritual beings, and we needed that soulish and spiritual renewal. The ice age cycle we're in actually guarantees that we got places where we can escape. So, for example, New York City. Just north of New York City, you have a very beautiful area all carved out by the retreat of the last ice age, what we call the Adirondacks. And I know a lot of people live in New York and Montreal. That's where they go to escape the stress of a busy life. Well, again, we need to recognize that we live in a unique time. Most of Earth's history, no ice at all, brief periods of ice. But we have these periods of ice. Unlike the Ice Age cycle, they tend to look like this. They're slush ball events. We're not just talking 20% coverage of the planet. We're talking 40, 50, in some cases as much as 90% of the planet was covered with ice. Now, what makes it especially remarkable that we have an ice age right now is what we understand is happening to the physics of the sun. And this is what the sun's brightness looks like with respect to time, namely that we have the sun getting much brighter as it accumulates mass, and as it loses mass, it gets dimmer, and then it gradually gets brighter and brighter as it converts hydrogen into helium. Now, here we have ice ages. You'd expect to have ice ages here because the sun is dim. The remarkable thing, look how bright the sun is today, and we've got an ice age. By all that we would think about the physics of the earth, we should not be having any ice at all. The sun is at a sufficiently bright point that how is it that we've got ice? And I'm going to be actually explaining why it is, in spite of the very bright luminosity of the sun, we got an ice age today. It's thanks to some amazing geological events that this is possible. Again, this is what the ice age looks like right now, and it's cyclical. The reason why it's cyclical is that the temperature of our planet is delicately balanced between having no ice at all and having a lot of ice. Because we're right at that dividing point between no ice and ice, there's a possibility of an ice age cycle. And I'll explain later why it is that it is cyclical. But what I want to talk about are five miraculous tectonic events that allowed us to have ice when the sun's luminosity would say there's no possibility for ice. So it's 5 simultaneous miraculous tectonic events that actually allowed our planet, as bright as our sun is, to have an ice age. Okay, so this is miracle number 1, is what happened to Antarctica. Antarctica, a few tens of millions of years ago, was attached to Australia. I mean, we have what's called the Great Australian Bight. Notice that it matches what we see here in Antarctica. So Antarctica split off from Australia, and then it became attached to South America, and then it broke off from South America about 40 million years ago and began to drift towards the South Pole. And so this is where it is today, right smack on the South Pole. But what actually helped cool the planet, not just that the South Antarctica was at the South Pole, so it would actually make it cold enough that ice could form, but we have this large open water all the way around Antarctica. And because of that large open water, you get a circulation of wind and water that we call the Roaring Forties. Maybe you've read some novels of what it was like in 200 years ago, where seafarers would be down here and their ships would be wrecked by the Roaring Forties. But because of this powerful circulation around Antarctica, it works to dramatically cool not just the South Atlantic Ocean, but the North Atlantic Ocean as well. And starting about 3 million years ago, thousands of feet of ice began to build up in Antarctica. And today, Antarctica has got the largest store of ice on the planet. And of course, where you got ice, it's going to reflect sunlight. And so as the beams of sunlight fall down in Antarctica, it reflects away, and that works to cool not just Antarctica, but literally the entire planet. That's miracle number 1. Miracle number 2 is what happened to Greenland. And so Greenland, just a few tens of millions of years ago, was right off here by Newfoundland and didn't have ice. But then it began to tectonically move northward, and it moved northward by 18 degrees latitude. Roughly equivalent to the distance between Miami and New York was the movement of Greenland. And today, Greenland ranks as the northernmost landmass on the planet. It's the closest to the North Pole. But as it moved over into this region here, tectonically it moved over what we call a hot spot, where there's this plume within the mantle. And what that plume within the mantle did is it caused Greenland, which had an average elevation of less than 1,000 feet, to be lifted up, so that most of Greenland is now at 10,000 feet. And it's the uplift of Greenland and the movement towards the North Pole that caused all this ice to form over Greenland. And so right now it's 86% covered with ice, but during the last ice age it was 100% covered with ice. But likewise, just with like with Antarctica, all that ice coverage reflects sunlight away. And so it not only makes Greenland colder, it makes the entire planet colder than it otherwise would be. Okay, miracle number 3 is what happened to Pangaea. 250 million years ago, we have this supercontinent. And as Jeff was explaining yesterday, the geological cycle of the Earth is you have a supercontinent that breaks up, comes back together, breaks up, comes back together with a cycle of about 500 million years. So 250 million years ago, a supercontinent broke up, but for the first time in the entire supercycle continent, it broke up in such a way that we had a movement of continental landmass towards the North Pole. So the continents split up, but then they began to move towards the North Pole, and they moved in such a way as to virtually enclose the Arctic Sea. And it's all this landmass surrounding the Arctic Sea that cooled the Arctic Sea sufficiently that a polar ice cap formed. And with the forming of a polar ice cap, that too reflected sunlight away and worked to cool the whole planet. Okay, tectonic miracle number 4. And by the way, these are all happening at the same time. We're talking, this is all coming together about 3 million years ago. Miracle number 4 is what happened to North and South America. So 10 million years ago, North and South America were separated from one another, and you could get ocean water flowing between the Pacific and the Atlantic. Now, meanwhile, these tectonic events were cooling the Atlantic Ocean, but what was getting in the way is warm Pacific Ocean water would come in between North and South America. But again, 3 million years ago, a tectonic event worked so that South America drifted towards North America and formed an isthmus, which stopped the flow of warm Pacific Ocean water into the Atlantic and actually set up the Gulf Stream, such that it looks like this today. So we now have a blockage preventing the movement of Pacific Ocean water into the Atlantic at this particular region. Now, the 5th miracle is the most significant one of all, and this is what happened to the Indian subcontinent. It was attached to Antarctica, split off from Antarctica about 90 million years ago, and then became attached to Madagascar. But starting about 60 to 70 million years ago, it broke off from Madagascar and then speeded towards Asia. And this is the most rapid tectonic movement we've been able to measure in the entire history of the Earth. You know, typical rapid tectonic movements are 3 to 4 centimeters a year. This movement is 20 centimeters per year. So we got the Indian subcontinent racing towards Asia. And it hit Asia at a high speed. And when it did that, it crumpled up the seafloor between Asia and the Indian subcontinent, and those are the Himalayas. The Himalayas today are crumpled up seafloor that existed between the two continents. Now, the collision is actually still proceeding. India today is moving 5 centimeters per year, which is still considered to be a very rapid movement, moving 5 centimeters per year into Eurasia, which is causing the Tibetan Plateau to get higher and higher and the Himalayas to get higher and higher. So Sir Edmund Hillary did not climb the highest mountain in the world. It was actually about 16 inches less tall when he climbed it than it is today. What this did is it formed an ice cap over the Tibetan Plateau and the Himalayas. And even though we're in a warm interglacial right now, the amount of ice stored in the Himalayas and the Tibetan Plateau today is the 3rd largest store of ice on the planet. It's actually greater than we have in the polar ice cap. It's just behind Antarctica and Greenland. But here's the difference. The ice over the Himalayas and the Tibetan Plateau is a lot closer to the equator than Antarctica and Greenland. And because it's so much closer to the equator, sunlight that reflects off of the Tibetan Plateau reflects 4 times more efficiently the heat and light from the sun than we get off Greenland or Antarctica. So that's why I made the point. It has the most dramatic impact on cooling our planet. And because it's still going on, the cooling impact gets greater and greater with every cycle. And this actually explains how we transition from a 41,000-year cycle to a 100,000-year cycle, and why during the last 8 cycles, each ice age maximum has been greater than the previous one. So we human beings are living right after the most severe of the maximal ice ages that have ever existed in this ice age cycle. And by the way, that explains why we can have such a productive world today, is because we are the beneficiaries of living on planet Earth after the most severe ice age in the entire ice age cycle. Now, I promised earlier I would explain what it is that makes it cyclical. It's an astronomical thing. You thought I was just going to talk about geology? No, I'm an astronomer. I'm going to bring some astronomy in here. And it has to do with the variations in Earth's orbit and rotation. And so I'm going to ignore the rotation for a bit and first just get into what happens to our orbit. Okay. The Earth orbits about the Sun, and it's a very stable orbit, but it has tiny variations. And so the tilt of our orbit relative to the solar system plane changes very slightly. It changes from 21.5 degrees to 24 degrees. Right now it's 23.5. Now the greater the tilt of our rotation axis relative to the solar system plane, the warmer the planet becomes. So one reason why we're in a warm interglacial where we have minimum ice is because the tilt is close to that 24 degrees maximum. And this is a cycle of 41,000 years. So every 41,000 years it goes from 24 degrees to 21.5 degrees back up to 24 degrees. But again, the tilt affects the climate and explains why we go from a little bit cooler to a little bit warmer over that time. Now, the shape of the orbit also changes. All planets have an elliptical orbit as they go around their stars. But what's unique about our solar system is all 8 planets have highly circular orbits. They're elliptical but very close to circular. But in the case of the Earth, the circularity or the ellipticity of our orbit does change. It changes from being almost 0 to about 0.06. Right now it's about 0.055. So right now we're near maximum ellipticity in our orbit, and it's kind of like the tilt. The greater the ellipticity in our orbit, the warmer the planet becomes. And so when we get down to being very close to circular, that's going to cool the planet, and when it becomes more elliptical, that's going to warm the planet. Now in this case, there are 2 cycles. There's a 100,000-year cycle and a 400,000-year cycle. And the fact that we have a 100,000-year ice age cycle today is predominantly being driven by this eccentricity variation. That is a 100,000-year cycle, so that explains why our ice age cycle is approximately 100,000 years. Okay, going back to this. Previous ice ages were not cyclical. This ice age and only this ice age was cyclical. And because of the rise of the Tibetan Plateau, we have transitioned from a 41,000-year cycle to a 100,000-year cycle. And again, if it's only a 41,000-year cycle, you only get about 1,500 years of warm conditions. If it's a 100,000-year cycle, you can count on about 10,000 years of warmer conditions. Now, this is kind of a diagram. This is actually what the ice age cycle looks like in detail. So this is a measure of temperature. And by the way, the temperature difference is 24 degrees Fahrenheit. So when you're at ice age maximum, the planet is actually 24 degrees cooler than it would be today. So that's the range of temperature. And what you can see is the temperature varies quite a bit during the ice age. So you can have periods during the ice age where it's a little bit warmer than others. But what you notice during the last 4 ice ages, when you do have minimum ice, it's short-lived. Typically what you see is that the temperature spikes up very rapidly to a maximum. It hits a maximum and drops rapidly back down into an ice age. And we see this happening at all these ice ages. Here it's not quite as spiky as it was in the past. So all the ice ages where we had a warm interglacial, the temperature rise and fall was a sharp spike. Here it's not so sharp a spike, and here it's quite different again. And this really explains why it is we can have billions of people enjoying high civilization technology. This is when we're during the ice age maximum, and notice how rapidly the temperature is varying. A couple of papers have been published just in the last 6 months making the point that if the mean global temperature is varying this much, it's impossible to sustain any kind of large-scale agriculture. So it explains why humans during this period, we don't have any archaeological remains of any kind of extensive agriculture, mainly because the climate was so unstable it would not permit it. And likewise, I think it's possible, as we see in Genesis 4, that humans during this time may have actually had metallurgy going on, but it would have been at such an extremely low level because of the rapid variation in the climate that we don't have any remains of that evidence to this day. But beginning about 12,000 years ago, the temperature begins to rise in a very steady way, and then it plateaus. 9,000 years ago, we see this plateau. And climatologists refer to this as the long, warm spring. The temperature is not at a maximum. The maximum is somewhere up here. It literally stops short of 3 or 4 degrees centigrade, about 7 degrees Fahrenheit, from the maximum we see in previous Ice Age interglacials, and it's just remained constant throughout this period. So what we have here is a period of extreme climate stability that has lasted for the last 9,000 years. Now, scientists are still trying to understand why it is we have this period of extreme climate stability. The norm for the planet is climate instability. Literally over the whole 4.5 billion year history, where you do have ice, the only time in the history where the Earth had a little bit of ice, where you have this extreme climate stability. But we do have one clue. We know this isn't the only factor, but I mentioned earlier that in addition to variations in the orbit of planet Earth, there's variations in the rotation of planet Earth. And it's called the precession. And so you may have seen these gyroscopes. In fact, we've got a gyroscope here that Jeff is going to demonstrate for us. And what you can do, you can spin the gyroscope rapidly. Point is, this happens for all rapidly spinning bodies. So the Earth rapidly spins on its rotation axis once every 24 hours. But what you'll notice about the axis is it does a slow precession of about 45 degrees relative to the background stars. And Jeff is going to set this up, and you'll actually see how the gyroscope spins rapidly, but you're going to be able to see a slow movement like this of the axis. And this is something you can see with every gyroscope. But the cycle here is 26,000 years. So, for example, right now, our rotation axis points to the star Polaris. But literally 13,000 years from now, our rotation axis will be pointing towards the star Vega. And another 26,000 years from now, it'll be back to pointing towards Polaris. But here's how it's benefiting us from today. Remember I mentioned how with the breakup of Pangaea, the continents split apart and began to move towards the north? It is such that almost all the landmass of planet Earth is above the equator. Now, what I want you to notice, this is 30 degrees south latitude. Notice we just have a little bit of... we got Tasmania and New Zealand, and we got the south tip of South America, but it really doesn't add up to much land area. But look at all the land area we got above 30 degrees latitude. Okay. Anybody know what's happened that was of special importance on July 3rd? What's so important about July 3rd? July 3rd is that date when we were farthest away from the sun. Okay, that's our summer. What that means is, because of the precession of the Earth, we have cooler summers and warmer winters. And so this actually helps give us a more benign climate in the northern hemisphere. Now, for those people living the south tip of South America, it's the opposite. The winters are colder than they otherwise would be, and the summers are hotter. But because so many of us are living in the northern hemisphere, we have the benefit of having cooler summers and warmer winters. And so that's one explanation, but we scientists know that there's got to be other factors, maybe human factors, that explain why we have this extended period of climate stability. Now, if you're not yet convinced that all this is the miraculous hand of God to make possible billions of people coming to faith in Christ, here's one more miracle that I want to tack on, an astronomical miracle. And it has to do with supernova. You say, what's a supernova? It's a supergiant star that burns up quickly, and when it ends its burning cycle, it explodes. And when it explodes, it literally shines with the light of more than 100 billion normal stars. So here's a galaxy here. Here's a star in the galaxy that's just gone supernova. You can see how bright it is relative to everything else. And it remains bright for several months. So, for example, you've got the star going supernova, and then it fades. And here it goes supernova, and it fades. It only does it once. But in a typical spiral galaxy, and by the way, life is only possible in a spiral galaxy, you get about 3 supernova eruptions every century. You say, what happens if a star close to us goes supernova? Well, we know Sirius eventually will go supernova. It's 8 light years away. If we were to go supernova tomorrow, we'd all be gone. I mean, it radiates out deadly radiation. Not a good thing to be around when a supernova is close. Any nearby supernova is bad news for civilization. Well, there's a paper that got published just 6 months ago in the Astrophysical Journal that makes the point that during the last 300,000 years, there's been 23 supernova eruptions that were close enough to significantly damage our ozone shield. And you say, what would that do? It allows ultraviolet radiation to pour through from the sun with such intensity that it's going to seriously limit your ability to produce food. So the fact is we're very dependent on having just a small amount of ultraviolet radiation so we can grow the wheat, the rice, the corn that we need to sustain our population and our civilization. And what these astronomers were able to demonstrate is that human beings were around during this whole era. We know that for a variety of reasons. A book's coming out on Who is Adam, a new edition, that it's going to make the point that indeed Adam was created before this time. But notice, that was during the last ice age. Human population wasn't that large. Because of climate instability, we couldn't really develop the agriculture. So the fact that these supernovae were exploding and making serious holes in our ozone shield and making it impossible for us to grow hundreds of millions of tons of grain really wasn't a big issue because there weren't that many people around that needed all that grain. And so it really didn't impact humanity because we didn't have the global civilization. However, once we move into that era where we had this extraordinary climate stability that for the first time makes possible billions of people depending upon extensive cultivation over most of the land mass of the earth, we don't have any nearby supernova. Now, any supernova that's more than 1,500 light years away is going to do no damage to our planet's ability to grow extensive grains and sustain billions of people and high technology civilization. So yeah, lots of supernovae have been exploding, but none of them are close enough to be a risk. And so, again, I'm making this suggestion. This isn't an accident. This is something that God controlled and engineered for us. In the same era in which we have this amazing climate stability lasting for 9,000 years, we also have this period in which there are no sufficiently nearby supernova to pose a risk. And so the era where there's no nearby supernova is identical to this era of extraordinary climate stability. Now, it's because of this extraordinary climate stability that we can actually see God working out his redemption plan. If you read through the entire Bible, you notice that God develops different strategies depending on the level of civilization of humanity. So, for example, what does he say to Abraham? Leave your country and go to the land of Canaan. What's special about the land of Canaan? It's the juncture of 3 continents, Africa, Asia, and Europe. And because there wasn't high-tech civilization at that time, God says, stay in one place. And as the peoples on these continents trade with one another, they'll be forced to go through your land. That'll be your opportunity to share the redemptive message. And then we have Jesus coming right at the time of Caesar Augustus. What's special about that? Caesar Augustus said, I'm not going to do what my uncle Julius did. I'm not going to try to expand the empire. He established peace throughout the Roman Empire, and he built this amazing system of roads. So what did Jesus say to his disciples? We're going to use a different strategy. I don't want you to stay in one place. Take advantage of Roman peace and Roman roads and take the gospel to all parts of the Roman Empire and beyond. And that's what they did. And so what I'm going to share with you here are some statistics that have been developed by Ralph Winter, the founder of the U.S. Center for World Mission. He attended our Sunday school class on an off-and-on basis over the course of 20 years, had many dialogues with him. He's actually published this, so you can see this in print. And what he has done is to determine the number of non-Christians relative to Christians throughout the New Testament era. And, it's hard to define. Lots of people claim they're Christians and really aren't. But this is the definition he came up with. A non-Christian is someone who, if you ask him, are you a Christian, would say no. A Christian is someone who is visibly involved in fulfilling the Great Commission. So someone who is a regular church attender, who donates to missions and evangelism and is active in missions and evangelism. Now he says you can come up with different definitions. That's not the issue. I simply want to show you the trend with respect to time. And this is the trend he comes up with. Thanks to this amazing climate stability, we see civilization gradually becoming more and more advanced, the population getting bigger and bigger. But thanks to the advancing population, Christians are able to take the good news of salvation through Jesus Christ to progressively more and more people. And this shows you the ratio of non-Christians to Christians shrinking with respect to time. Now, Ralph Winter passed away a few years ago, and the last time he published on this was in 1990, where he said the ratio is now down to 7-1. Researchers at the U.S. Center for World Mission are saying right now it's below 5-1. Now, what is the fulfillment of the Great Commission? The one text I know of in the Bible that gives us a hint, actually there's a couple. Jesus made the comment, a majority would not become Christians, but it would be a large minority. Broad is the gate that leads to condemnation, but he also indicated that it would be a large non-majority. Zechariah 13 defines the fulfillment of the Great Commission for the Jewish people group. 1/3 will recognize the one whom they have pierced. And if it's 1/3 for the Jews, I think it's 1/3 for all the Gentile people groups of the world as well, or at least roughly in that category. The good news for the fulfillment of the Great Commission, it's within reach. Even 20 years ago, Ralph Winter would say when he was speaking in churches, right now, evangelical Christians have the people, the money, and the technology to fulfill the Great Commission in 5 years or less. All they lack is the motivation. That statement is still true for us today. In fact, we have more resources than existed back when Ralph Winter made that statement. But to take you back to what we're seeing here in the Ice Age cycle, we have this period of amazing climate stability that's enabling us to sustain this high technology civilization where we can quickly take the good news to all the people groups of the world. However, when we look at the science of this climate stability, there's no way we can sustain it for a lot longer. People ask me, well, how much longer? I say, well, the climate, or the variations of Earth's orbit by itself means that no matter what we human beings do, we're going to be entering a period of extreme climate stability in less than 2,000 years. And hey, it's possible that through human activity we could speed that up and make it happen within 50 years. However, we have the resources to fulfill the Great Commission in much less time than that. We just simply need to be motivated, and perhaps this kind of knowledge by itself will motivate believers to do what we can to bring about the fulfillment of Revelation 7:9, where indeed a great multitude from every tribe, nation, language, people, billions of people, literally from every people group of the world, would become followers of Jesus Christ. But my closing message is, this is the time to make it happen. And what we're trying to do at Reasons to Believe is say, let's reach the educated peoples of the world, because they're the ones that can take the good news of salvation to those who lack that degree of education and technology. Now is the time to make it happen. Thank you.
This has been a presentation of the Ministry of Reasons to Believe. To discover a wealth of resources, or if you have questions related to science and the Christian faith, please visit our website at reasons.org or call us toll-free at 855-REASONS. That's 855-732-7667.